March 3, 1943. Time, 10:15 hours. Location, Bismarck Sea, 30 nautical miles northwest of Lae, New Guinea. A Japanese naval officer, his hands slick with blackened oil, clung tightly to the shattered remains of the destroyer Arashio's bridge. His uniform was drenched in seawater and fuel, his body trembling from shock. Every detail of that morning would remain carved into his memory for the rest of his life. Through stinging, salt-burned eyes, he looked out over the endless wreckage. American B-25 Mitchell bombers circled back overhead, passing low across a sea filled with oil slicks, fires, and the debris of shattered ships. Thousands of men were left struggling for their lives, desperately holding on to floating wreckage. Only 2 days earlier, the Japanese convoy had sailed out of Rabaul with confidence. Now, what had been 8 troop transports and 8 destroyers was reduced to twisted wreckage scattered across the sea. For the survivors, the nightmare was only beginning. On February 28th, 6,900 soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army's elite 51st Division had boarded their ships at Simpson Harbor, Rabaul. Their mission was to reinforce Lae and reverse the tide of battle in New Guinea. Instead, they were about to experience a devastating defeat that challenged everything they believed about war. Every lesson they had been taught, every expectation of honor, and every assumption about American conduct on the battlefield. The planning for this operation had begun in late December 1942, inside Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo. Lieutenant General Hitoshi Imamura, commander of the 8th Area Army based at Rabaul, faced growing desperation in New Guinea. Tokyo ordered a major reinforcement. The plan called for 8 destroyers to escort 8 transport ships carrying the core of the 51st Division, battle-tested troops transferred from China. On February 28, 1943, the convoy finally set sail. In addition to the transports and destroyers, nearly 100 Japanese fighter aircraft provided air cover. Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, commanding the operation from the destroyer Shirayuki, was no novice. A veteran of convoy missions, he knew the odds were dangerous. Japanese Army staff had even run war games beforehand. Their estimate was grim. Out of 10 transports, at least 4 would likely be lost, and 30 to 40 aircraft might not return. Success was rated at no more than 50%. March 1, 1943. As the convoy skirted the northern coast of New Britain, the first Allied reconnaissance aircraft appeared, a B-24 Liberator from the 91st Bombardment Group. What Kimura and his men did not know was that their mission had already been compromised. Allied codebreakers in Melbourne, Frumel, and Washington, D.C. had intercepted and decrypted Japanese messages. American commanders knew the convoy's destination, schedule, and strength before it ever set sail. At 5th Air Force Headquarters, General George Kenney finally received the news he had been waiting for. For months, his crews had been training with a brand new tactic, skip bombing. This method, developed by several nations during the war, allowed aircraft to release bombs at very low altitude, causing them to bounce across the water's surface and strike a ship's hull. Major Paul Pappy Gunn had further modified the B-25 Mitchell, equipping the aircraft with as many as 8 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns in the nose. These gunship bombers, armed with skip bombs and heavy firepower, were designed to tear through convoys at close range. Dawn broke gray and cloudy on March 2nd. At 10 hours, the weather cleared just enough for the attack to begin. A formation of 29 B-17 flying fortresses appeared high overhead. Their bombs struck hard, sinking 1 merchant vessel, damaging 2 others, and setting a destroyer ablaze. The first major loss was the transport Kyokusei Maru, which carried 2,500 troops along with drums of aviation fuel. The 5,493-ton ship was ripped apart by explosions, breaking in half and sinking in flames. The destroyers Asagumo and Yukikaze raced in to rescue survivors, hauling fuel-soaked men from the water. But this act of mercy forced the convoy to slow down, leaving them vulnerable to more attacks. March 3, 1943. The morning sky was clear, ideal flying weather. The Japanese convoy, reduced to 7 transports and 8 destroyers, had already covered 2/3 of the distance to Leh. But at 10 hours the final assault began. First, high-altitude B-17s appeared again, drawing Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire upward. Then, while eyes and guns were fixed on the sky, 13 Australian bow fighters swept in at near sea level, unleashing their heavy forward-firing cannons and tearing into the decks of the transports. Next came the low-flying B-25s. Modified into deadly gunships, they skimmed so close to the waves that their propellers sent spray across the water. They fired devastating machine gun bursts while dropping bombs that skipped like stones across the sea, smashing into hulls or detonating just beneath the surface. The results were catastrophic. Within minutes, ships were ablaze, transports were sinking, and the Japanese convoy was shattered beyond repair. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had reached its climax. In less than 15 minutes, Japan had suffered one of its most decisive defeats of the Pacific War. Captain Ed Larner, leading the 90th Squadron's modified B-25 bombers, swept in at wave-top height toward the transport Teo Maru. His nose-mounted guns hammered the vessel, silencing its anti-aircraft crews. Moments later, the bombs released from his aircraft skipped twice across the surface before slamming into Teo Maru's side, right at the waterline. The 6,870-ton transport broke apart and sank within minutes. By 10:15, only 15 minutes after the opening strike, all 7 transports had been hit, several already sinking. 3 destroyers were either heavily damaged or gone entirely. Admiral Kimura's flagship, the destroyer Shirayuki, took a bomb that ignited her forward magazine. The ship vanished in a massive blast that shook the entire battlefield. By midday on March 3rd, the Bismarck Sea had become a nightmare. Thick oil fires burned on the surface. Wreckage and bodies floated everywhere. The water was coated in fuel, and thousands of Japanese soldiers and sailors struggled to stay alive. Many were wounded, others clung to planks and rafts, while countless men who couldn't swim simply thrashed until exhaustion took them. Estimates put more than 3,000 survivors in the sea. The 4 remaining destroyers, Yukikaze, Asagumo, Uranami, and Shikinami, moved in to rescue as many as they could. Roughly 2,700 men were hauled aboard and taken back toward Rabaul. But the rescue effort couldn't last. At 14 hours on March 3rd, Allied aircraft returned. Survivors at first felt relief, thinking the planes were there to record the destruction. That feeling quickly turned to terror when the aircraft dropped to wave height and opened fire. In a controversial move, American and Australian squadrons spent the next several days strafing men in lifeboats and rafts. Bombers and fighters raked the waters repeatedly. B-25s, A-20 Havocs, and bow fighters made low passes, their machine guns shredding the sea into foam. From the Allied point of view, the justification was straightforward. Those men were enemy soldiers. If they reached New Guinea's shore, they would strengthen the Japanese garrison at Leh. General Kenney's orders left no doubt. No Japanese troops were to land alive. But for the Japanese in the water, this was unthinkable. The Bushido Code taught that defeated enemies should be treated with dignity. Instead, they found themselves mercilessly attacked, their expectations of honor shattered. As night fell on March 3rd, new dangers came. 10 U.S. Navy PT boats under Lieutenant Commander Barry Atkins swept into the area. Using searchlights, they hunted survivors across the wreckage field, firing machine guns as they went. PT-43 and PT-150 discovered the damaged transport Oigawa Maru still afloat. They launched torpedoes, sending the ship and hundreds more men into the sea. For the survivors, the night was filled with horror. Sharks, drawn by blood and desperate thrashing, began attacking. Men who had endured sinking ships and strafing runs now faced death from below. When dawn broke on March 4th, the scale of the disaster was clear. The wreckage stretched across nearly 40 miles of ocean. Scattered groups of survivors still floated after more than 20 hours in the water. The Allies returned with the sunrise. Patrols of B-25s, A-20s, bow fighters, and P-38 Lightnings swept across the debris field, strafing anything that moved. Rescue ships were also targeted. The destroyer Asashio, which had stayed behind to recover men from the crippled Arashio, became a prime target. During the morning attacks, a B-17 dropped a 500-pound, 230 bomb squarely on her. A Sashio sank quickly, taking rescued soldiers down with her. For the Americans, there was another motive beyond tactics: revenge. In earlier fighting, Lieutenant Woodrow W. Moore's B-17 Double Trouble had been rammed by a Zero fighter. 7 crewmen bailed out, only to be gunned down by Japanese pilots as they descended in their parachutes. Other U.S. crews had witnessed the atrocity. The memory left many determined to return the cruelty in kind. General Kenney later described the strafing as mopping up operations. Over the following days, American and Australian airmen returned again and again, systematically scouring the seas to ensure no Japanese survivors escaped. As a final measure, General Kenney ordered his air crews to strafe Japanese rafts and lifeboats. He described these attacks with the sanitized phrase, mopping up operations. A secret report dated March 20, 1943 noted bluntly, the slaughter continued until nightfall. If any survivors managed to escape our aircraft, they were still at least 30 miles from shore and adrift in waters swarming with man-eating sharks. Japanese submarines I-17 and I-26 tried to mount rescue efforts, moving carefully to avoid Allied patrols. On March 6, I-17 and I-26 managed to save 170 men. 2 days later, I-26 located another 54 survivors and landed them at Leh. But the submarines had very limited capacity, forcing their crews to make impossible choices. They described heartbreaking scenes: men too weak to climb aboard, voices crying out in the darkness, and the need to decide who could be saved and who would be left behind. The overall losses were staggering. Out of the 6,900 Japanese soldiers meant to reinforce New Guinea, only about 1,200 ever reached Leh. Roughly 2,700 were rescued by destroyers and submarines and taken back to Rabaul. Around 3,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed. By comparison, American and Australian losses were tiny, only 4 aircraft and 13 airmen. The casualty ratio of 230 to 1 was almost without precedent in modern naval warfare. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea became a turning point. The disaster was so complete that Japan never again attempted to send large troop convoys through waters within range of Allied aircraft. Surface reinforcements to New Guinea by transport ship were effectively abandoned. After the war, Captain Tameichi Hara, commander of the destroyer Shigure, which had not been present in the battle, interviewed survivors and wrote the most famous Japanese assessment. He described it as a complete debacle, the exact opposite of Japan's earlier successful withdrawal from Guadalcanal. Survivors spoke not just of physical losses, but of psychological collapse. Many described the defeat as unbelievable. The battle also highlighted a revolution in aerial warfare. Skip bombing, combined with heavily armed strafer aircraft, had transformed medium bombers into lethal ship killers. After Pearl Harbor in December 1941, skip bombing was first used effectively in the Pacific by Major William Benn of the 63rd Squadron, 43rd Bomb Group, 5th Air Force. Later, Major Paul Pappy Gunn of the 90th Squadron, 3rd Bomb Group, perfected the method by heavily modifying A-20s and B-25s with 8 to 14 forward-firing, 50-caliber machine guns. These aircraft could smash a ship's defenses at close range before dropping bombs with deadly precision. Not every survivor perished at sea. Small groups washed ashore on remote islands, beginning desperate fights to survive. One group of 18 landed on Kirawina, where they were captured by PT-114. Another reached Guadalcanal, only to be killed by an American patrol. On Goodenough Island, Australian troops hunted down stragglers. Between March 8 and 14, 1943, patrols from the 47th Infantry Battalion found and killed 72 Japanese soldiers, captured 42, and discovered another 9 dead on a raft. The Japanese did not learn until after the war that their convoy had been doomed before it ever sailed. Allied intelligence had intercepted their communications. Codebreakers in Melbourne, Frumel, and Washington, D.C. had decrypted messages that revealed the convoy's destination, composition, and schedule. Convinced that their codes were unbreakable, the Japanese had walked directly into a carefully prepared Allied trap. For Japan's military, raised on the Bushido Code, the massacre in the Bismarck Sea created a deep moral crisis. Bushido taught honor in battle, respect for enemies, and dignity in defeat. Watching Allied aircraft systematically gun down men adrift in the sea violated every belief they held about the rules of war. Survivors who returned to Rabaul were deeply shaken. They had seen American ruthlessness firsthand, something very different from the image of weakness Japanese propaganda had promoted. The memory of aircraft hunting helpless men across the sea haunted Japanese troops throughout the Pacific War. Many survivors admitted they lost all hope of ultimate victory. The lesson they carried was grim. If Americans would machine gun unarmed men in the water, then surrender was pointless. This belief contributed to Japan's infamous fight-to-the-death mindset later in the war. The strafing of survivors has remained controversial ever since. Under international law, shipwrecked men who are helpless should be protected. But the law was vague when it came to enemy combatants who had not formally surrendered. Both sides had already committed atrocities during the conflict, and in this case the line between military necessity and war crime was blurred. The Pacific War had already seen brutality. The rape of Nanking, the Bataan Death March, and the machine gunning of American pilots caught in parachutes. But what happened in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was different. Here the killing wasn't out of cruelty but carried out as a calculated tactic. American veterans later defended the decision, insisting it was a matter of military necessity. These were not men who had surrendered. They were still enemy troops trying to reach Lae and continue the fight. Some survivors were only 10 to 15 miles from shore, close enough that many could have reached land and rejoined the battle. The disaster in the Bismarck Sea forced Japan to completely rethink its strategy. Admiral Minichi Koga, who succeeded Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto as commander-in-chief, accepted a grim reality. Surface ships could no longer survive in seas controlled by Allied aircraft. With that recognition, New Guinea was effectively abandoned as impossible to defend. The psychological effects across the Japanese military were immense. Units preparing for transport began to suffer desertion at levels never seen before. The fear of being caught helpless at sea under American air attack became greater than the fear of facing combat on land. For the Allies, the lesson was equally powerful. The battle showed beyond doubt that air power alone could destroy naval forces. Land-based bombers, when properly armed and trained, could close sea lanes without needing aircraft carriers. This changed Pacific strategy for the rest of the war. Afterward, the question remained: did strafing survivors in the water amount to a war crime? Officially, the United States argued no. These men were enemy combatants still capable of reaching land and fighting again. Still, the debate lingered. The fact that Japanese officers were executed for similar acts while Americans were not was seen by many as an example of victor's justice. The Pacific War had been brutal on both sides, but only the defeated were held accountable in court. Historians today see the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as a turning point in the history of aerial warfare. The numbers alone tell the story. All 8 Japanese transports sunk, 4 destroyers destroyed, around 3,000 Japanese dead, while Allied losses were only 13 airmen and 4 planes. The casualty ratio was unlike anything seen before. But more than numbers, the battle revealed a new kind of warfare. Technology, intelligence, and strategy had combined to produce annihilation instead of just victory. The sight of aircraft systematically strafing men in the water became a haunting symbol of how merciless the Pacific War had become. General Douglas MacArthur himself called it the most decisive aerial battle of the Southwest Pacific Campaign. He was right, Japan never recovered from it. Their forces in New Guinea were cut off, unable to be reinforced or resupplied, and left to be slowly destroyed. For the Americans, the battle was proof of how far they had come. From the shock of Pearl Harbor in December 1941, they had transformed into a force capable of calculated, overwhelming destruction. The morality of strafing survivors continues to spark debate even now. Military necessity collided with humanitarian law in those oil-stained waters. The Pacific War kept pushing those limits again and again. In just 3 days of March 1943, American and Australian air power destroyed an entire Japanese convoy. Thousands were killed, and Japan's hopes of holding New Guinea were crushed. Survivors who saw their comrades hunted in the water carried those memories for life. They had seen an enemy who would show no mercy, far beyond what Japanese propaganda had ever suggested. The legacy of the battle stretched far beyond New Guinea. It proved that modern warfare had entered a new era, where aircraft, intelligence, and firepower could wipe out entire forces in hours. For Japan, It was the start of a long collapse in the Southwest Pacific. For the United States, it was confirmation that they had not only recovered from Pearl Harbor, but had become an unmatched war machine. The loss was staggering. Nearly 3,000 Japanese dead, not in hand-to-hand combat, but in a slaughter from the air. Those who survived brought back stories of American ruthlessness that deeply shook Japanese morale. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved that technology could deliver not just victory, but annihilation. It also left behind one of the war's most controversial legacies, the image of aircraft hunting defenseless men in the water. Over 3 days in March 1943, Japan learned a brutal lesson. The war had changed, and America was now capable of fighting with a level of cold efficiency they had never expected. That lesson would define the bloody course of the Pacific until its atomic end in 1945.